This is really about ministry. This is about the gospel. This is about passing on the faith tradition. And yes, they can come sit in a Sunday school and a church service for a few hours a week, but that is going to do nothing if they spend 30, 35, 40 hours a week getting the antithesis of that at a government school.
Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, US Pie's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and I have a fascinating show for you today. Joining me is Dr. Douglas Pietersma, a research associate at NERI, the National Home Education Research Institute. And we're going to be discussing some of the reasons behind the explosive growth in home education in America. Before we dive in, give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. And visit uspie.org to learn more and join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. U.S. Pie's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at US Pie on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few. Today, I am joined by Dr. Douglas Pietersma, a research associate at the National Home Education Research Institute, or NERI, where he serves as the editor of the peer-reviewed Homeschool Researcher Journal. He's an adjunct professor at Regent University's School of Education, a frequent writer and speaker at conferences and conventions. And he has also testified before legislators on education matters. In addition to his research and editing work, Dr. Pietersma is a father of 2 homeschool graduates and a pastor at a rural community church in Wyoming. Dr. Douglas Pietersma, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start by asking you what you talk about in your work, a distinction between education and schooling. So can you explain why those words are not interchangeable and what parents misunderstand when they assume that they're the same thing?
The history of what we would call government schooling, compulsory schooling, mass institutional schooling, it's really new in the history of the world, the long length of our world education. And so when you go back to the beginning and you ask the questions like, how did we have individuals like our founding fathers and others at the beginning of our nation who were so educated? And of course, if you read their work, you know that they were, but they didn't have this government supported and government run education system. And you start digging into the history of that, you realize that there was so much education that ever happened before anybody even got to what we might call a school today. Certainly there were schools back then. Young men went to certain schools, and sometimes young ladies went to separate schools. Most of the universities were focused on higher education that related to medical, legal, and the ministry work, so theology kinds of schools. And of course, the founding of many of our what we now call Ivy League schools were in fact in line with those. A lot of them were Bible schools with a focus on the word of the Lord. And so when you look at that, you ask the question, how did we have that then? The high level of literacy and the high level of knowledge. And then today, when we see reports from the National Assessment of Education Progress, and you just see the degradation of knowledge in our society today, how did we get here? And the answer is we got here through schooling. And when you start digging into schooling, what is schooling? How did it develop? Where did it start? How did it go from small to bigger and so forth? You realize the more it became school, the less it became education. And those things separated to the point now where I don't even associate them. I really try my hardest. I'll fail at this from time to time, but I really try to say home education when I talk about home education, because I don't like to call it homeschooling. I want to encourage those who are taking on the responsibility of educating their children to take away what is schooling that has nothing to do with, or very little to do with, or sometimes is detrimental to education and then to apply that in their home education environment. I really try to divest those two things because I don't believe that they're the same, and I do believe that the more we get attached to what we've become accustomed to seeing and doing in schooling, the less we actually have education, and that has really been borne out in the statistics and the data that we see all the time coming out of our government schooling system.
Well, that was an excellent explanation. And I think the first time I heard the term home education over homeschooling was through my friend Sam Sorbo. So she has encouraged people to pick up that vernacular, to quit calling it homeschooling. I know it's a common term. It's what everybody understands with that home education is. But I think it is good if we try to change the way we term things. And so that's why we at United States Parents Involved in Education, we don't use the term public school. We say government schools because that's in reality what they are. And we think it's important for people to properly term these things. So thank you for that great explanation. So
Like, I have
I wanted
Sam's
to.
book on the shelf behind me. I love her book. They're your children. So
Oh, yes, yes. My daughter-in-law was inspired by that book when she was trying to decide whether or not to homeschool, and she was such a great mentor to her. Sam is a fantastic woman that's really doing a lot of work on the education front across the country. We really appreciate her loaning her her life because she's a movie star and a producer, and she could be doing a lot of other things, but she has a heart and a passion for this, much like you and I do. So, you've written and spoken extensively about ineffective education paradigms. So, what do you see as the most ineffective education models that are dominating government schools? See, I slipped. And how parents can avoid or eliminate these ineffective models from their children's learning experience?
well, I kind of came up with a phrase that helped me to describe so many of the things that I was encountering through my research and through my studies on education. And academics love to come up coin phrases and come up with sometimes a little long and verbose statements that describe it. But it really does. I wanted to encapsulate all the things that I was bringing together. So when I use the term educationally ineffective schooling paradigms, it's because I was coming across so many things that schooling does that doesn't actually factor into education, or maybe it does, but not to the extent that people think it does, and sometimes it's detrimental. So a couple of those things, as you asked about, think about scheduling. Where did we come up with the idea that a school day needs to start somewhere between 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning and finish between, 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon? Whereas in the home education environment, we know that there are children who just love to learn at all different hours of the day. Sometimes they learn better or study better at different times of the day. Same thing with the annual schedule, starting in September and ending in May, like we did when I was growing up. Nowadays, schools tend to maybe start a little earlier and go a little later. But, where did all these sort of schedules and, again, who came up with the idea that it should be, 12 years or 13 if you count kindergarten, and that should complete your effort into learning things and so forth. Add 4 years if you decide to go to college. Those things don't actually factor into education. If somebody's interested in learning something, they can learn anytime, they can learn any place, they can learn outside of a schedule like that. So we know that we don't have to schedule schooling, education, learning at a particular time frame in order for it to be effective. So that's just one of the first ones. One of the more detrimental ones, I think, is actually the organization of what schooling is. So obviously, if you get millions of children, as we have here in the United States, who need to be taught and educated, and you put that under one big umbrella like we have the government schooling system, you have to organize it. It has to be organized. You can't just randomly throw all the children from a particular area together. So what do? Well, you group them. You're going to group them most likely by age. That's the primary way. School needs to start by the time they're 6 years old or whatever, kindergarten, first grade. Different states have different age starting ages for their compulsory schooling. That's when they should start. They have to be doing school by that particular point. And then, of course, you'll have some variations within a school system. Okay, you've got some students that have some special needs, so we're going to segregate those over here. Now you're separating by intellect. So you basically have age or intellect peer group organization. That's how that has to work in order to just functionally manage the number of children that there are. And we have seen that that does not really produce the outcomes that you would expect, that the at least the system would expect it to produce. One of the great criticisms of homeschooling, right, is socialization. Do homeschooled children get socialization? And if you think about it, I've had a number of authors who have used various descriptions along the lines of this. The peer group organization, the age peer group organization, is the most unnatural social organization that you can imagine, because we as adults don't sit around all day in groups of individuals who are close to our same age and who match us in some level or another of intellect, whether that be school accomplishment or whatever. We don't do that. We don't do that in the work environment. We don't do that in society. And so it's not necessarily a conducive manner for developing socialization, or as it would be called in the government schools. And then the last one, another one I would talk about is pedagogy. So that's the manner of teaching, right? You get a huge group of students in a classroom. It may be 20, and that's actually really low. Some classes 30 or more students in a class, and you have to teach them basically all the same thing. And we all know that students learn differently. Even if you talk to a government school teacher, they're going to tell you every child learns differently, every student learns differently, and they'll admit that. But they have to teach them all the same, because out of pragmatics, they can't take a class and teach it 30 different ways to 30 different children or students. And so they're going to shoot for the middle. They're going to aim for the average. I don't even like the word average, but aim for whoever's in the middle of a particular learning spectrum, and they may catch that person plus a couple on either side of it. But a bulk of those students are either going to be bored out of their mind because it's material that's at a level lower than what perhaps that they need, and another half is probably going to be struggling to keep up with the rest of the class, and so you lose just the huge wings on either side of what might be considered the average. The same thing goes with like curriculum and testing. In order to manage a large number of individuals, it has to be a standardized curriculum. It has to be the same thing that you give to everybody, because it's just not pragmatic to try to have 30 different curriculums in a particular classroom. And then you have to evaluate it. What do? You set a standard, and then you create a test. And we all know that when you have a standard and you create a test to measure that, and then you have a curriculum that's designed to teach it, there's inevitably going to be a certain amount of teaching to the test, which means students can be taught to answer the right questions, but they don't necessarily have to retain and absorb and apply that information in any kind of true educational sense. And so those are some of the things that I look at as educationally ineffective schooling paradigms. And when you pull away from schooling, you don't need any of those. I mean, we still have a pedagogy in a home education environment, but it can be different from one child to the next. We still have, learning styles, and we still have perhaps different curriculum that we select to use, but we can be very selective. And if we decide that this curriculum isn't working for that child, we change the curriculum. We go on to something that works for that child. And we certainly don't have to keep to any of the schedules for the most part. Some states do have certain requirements about hours or certain times a day that children have to be involved in educational activity, but a lot of states don't, and I live in one of those that is completely open. We can conduct our home education when we want, where we want, how we want, and it's a great freedom to have. And we pray and fight for all states and even all countries around the world to be able to gain that kind of a blessing and a privilege, as I consider it to be.
Yeah, you made some really good points there. It's some of the information I've heard from some other leaders around the country. I happened to have interviewed Israel Wayne last week, and he talked about this idea of separating by grade and age level, and he referred to Horace Mann and the Prussian model, which is actually, according to Israel, is a Marxist model for education that was adopted in this country. So it makes so much sense, but so many parents haven't even thought, about these things. And the paradigm that needs to happen, or the paradigm shift that needs to happen, is parents need to start thinking about this structure, this way, these educational models that we have in government schools. I mean, to me, it's common sense that they're hampering children in their ability to grow and be individuals and be intuitive. Just the simple fact of having to go to school and sit in your chair and be still, and you can't even talk in the lunchroom in some classes. When my children were in middle school, I believe, or it may have even been elementary, I was shocked when I was allowed to go eat lunch with my child and they weren't allowed to talk. So it's just crazy, the whole setup in general. But you've made some very good points about schedules and separation, um, and standards. Even, a lot of parents don't even recognize the fact that we haven't always had standards. Standards only evolved in about the 1980s, I believe, and then the Common Core standards were the worst of all, adopted all over the country in 2010, still in every state in the nation except for Florida. And the fight against the Common Core standards, because I was very involved with that, was some of what you were saying, that children don't all learn at the same pace. They don't all develop at the same pace. There's not a one size fits all education for students. And I really appreciate you sharing those points. And you're right on, in my opinion, and shared some things I haven't even thought about.
Earl Wayne
So,
too. One of his books is over my shoulder right there. So I always
yeah.
always like to highlight good material out there. Nobody pays me to sell their books, but he's got some good works out there.
Amen. I agree. We really have some amazing leaders on the move in our country today that are talking about the need for the paradigm shift and for people to be thinking outside the box. So I'm really thrilled to have you on the show today to add to our list of experts who are sharing this thought process for us, so that we can begin to think differently. It's time. We have to. I think in combination of the NAEP scores, which you alluded to earlier, the billions upon billions of dollars we're spending to not educate children because they're failing miserably. People need to start looking at this differently. And probably the fundamental problem, which we highlight in a report we just released titled "Are Government Schools Redeemable?" is the simple fact that government is involved. It was a bad idea to begin with to think that we should have government educating our children. So let me go on to another question, which has to do with a persistent myth. Now, you mentioned one of the persistent myths is the lack of socialization. I've heard that one for 20 years, I guess, and I think people are beginning to understand that that's just not the case. And there's wonderful homeschool co-ops and other functions that children have where they interact with other children. But the other myth that parents often consider themselves is that they're not qualified to teach, that they don't have the training or the credentials. And so, based on your research, what does the data actually show about parent qualifications and homeschool success?
Yeah, I've seen that too. And just looking into this issue, we've actually become a society that's kind of become addicted to certain certifications and qualifications. I'll give a totally off the cuff example, but it's a good example because my mom cut hair like a barber for years without any barber's license, never set up a shop, never made a living at it, but she was very, very good at it. But in order for her to set up a business and make money on that, she would have had to go to a school, get a certification, which would have qualified her to do that, right? And there's other industries too that are like that. Education has become that way, and it really does stem from that historical foundation. You mentioned Horace Mann, but further on down the historical line, you've got John Dewey establishing schools of education like Columbia, and training and certifying. And what we think teachers are trained and certified in doing isn't necessarily what they're actually trained and certified in doing. I've talked to a lot of former school teachers, some who have turned to homeschooling, and they will talk about their education. I was educated in how to manage a classroom, not necessarily how to pass information to children and make sure that they were learning. So as a society, parents have also sort of absorbed that. Well, if I'm going to do that function, I need to be certified, trained, educated, credentialed, whatever the word might be. And there is some statistical information that sort of gets converted and applied to home education, but it doesn't actually apply. And that is this: it is statistically shown, especially in the government institutional schooling system, that a parent's educational level corresponds with a student's academic achievement. In other words, if a child has parents who are both, college educated to the bachelor's level, then they're expected to, generally speaking, do better than perhaps a child whose parents are only high school graduates or who may not have finished high school. It goes the other way if parents have advanced degrees like master's or doctorate. And so that is a fact that people will hold on to, and then they will try to apply that to home education and say, well, then if that's the case, then the home educated parents need to have those kinds of credentials too, so that their children have the opportunity to also be academically advanced. Well, Dr. Brian Ray, who's the president of the organization I work for, the National Home Education Research Institute, he has conducted a number of studies. He published one in 2010 and another in 2013, which concluded that the advantage of a parent's academic achievement or a parent's educational level is actually mitigated in the home education environment, which means parents who have lesser education, high school diploma, or perhaps not even a high school diploma, are doing at least as well in educating their children at home as those who have bachelor's degrees or advanced degrees. And when you ask the question why, of course, we those of us that live in the home education environment know that parents can maximize certain aspects of education that also contribute to student academic achievement. And that is what makes up the difference. So, for instance, some of the other things that you talk about student academic achievement, student teacher ratios. That's always big, right? Public schools or government schools will also, talk about, hey, we need to have lower student teacher ratios. Why? Because they know that that is conducive to student academic achievement. Well, you can almost get no better student teacher ratios than most homeschools. Even if you have like a huge family. I have two children, so my homeschool family isn't huge. But I have others in my family, a sister of mine who has 15 children. They're all homeschooled as well. But even in that situation, a parent with 15 children. Well, that's not even a 1 to 15 student teacher ratio, because by the time the older ones get to the sort of end of their academic journey, as it may be set out, they're actually helping the younger ones. So it's really more of a 3 to 1, 4 to 1 kind of ratio, even in a family like that. And of course, you mentioned cooperatives where we collaborate with other families, so there are other advantages to take advantage of, other elements to take advantage of. So that's just one thing, student teacher ratios. It's great in the home education environment. Another one is called academic engagement time. And this one was, I first read about it, I think, from researcher Stephen Duvall. And it was kind of a late 90s study, I believe it was, where he was talking about academic engagement time. That's the actual amount of time a teacher engages with a student. So in a classroom of, 30 students, one teacher can actively engage with a student on average 2 minutes per hour. That's what each student is going to get. And that's assuming the teacher like equally divides attention among all the students. Well, in a home education environment, put four kids in a room and a parent teaching them. Well, they're going to get at least 15 minutes, right? That is multiple times more academic engagement time that student is going to get. And so that is also a predictor of student achievement. So when you look at what creates student achievement, parents in a home education environment, despite their personal educational level, can maximize those elements that are conducive to student academic achievement, and therefore it's mitigated. The fact that a parent may not have gone very far in their education is not a hampering effect, because they know their children the best. They understand, they don't have to learn at the beginning of the school year. How does this student learn? Every teacher that gets a whole classroom full of new students has got so many students to learn in a short span of time. And one academic year really is a short span of time. Whereas a parent who's been teaching that child from the time they were an infant how to, hold a spoon and how to potty train and how to do all the things that they had to do up to the point of starting school age, which again, what is the age in a home education environment? Homeschooling starts at birth and it just continues until the child is no longer at home. So that's how that can be mitigated. And the fact that in a home education environment, the parents don't necessarily have to have teacher qualifications or certifications or degrees in education or anything along those lines.
Okay, so I made a couple notes on some of the things you were talking about, and just kind of a funny aside is you talked about how home education begins at birth. And I just had the thought that, well, government would sure like to get a hold of our children at birth and begin with them from that point forward. I think that would be their ultimate goal.
They've made
But
moves towards that to try to lower, compulsory schooling age and get it
right,
involved in more younger preschool. They've tried to do that multiple
right.
times with various efforts, and thankfully they haven't been quite that successful. And but we can imagine they'll continue to fight in that direction.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, in our state of South Carolina, it's been 6 or 8 years ago now, there was a bill that we fought that was a data collection process they were putting in place, and they were going to combine all these data silos, and they wanted to start tracking children prenatally. So it was PK through 20W. And so we believe the P stood for prenatal, and then it's 20 years of education, and the W is into the workforce. So, yes, they want to get them younger, keep them longer. They have after school programs. I mean, that's one of the things I encourage parents to consider is your child is in this failed system with negative peer influence for more waking hours than they are at home. And it is as though the government is raising their children. And one other
Course of
point I
K
wanted to
through
make,
sorry,
go ahead.
over the course of K through 12 education, some estimates are in excess of 17,000 hours that a child will spend separated from their family in that institution, and that's just K through 12, right? You don't add in, sending them away to college and stuff like that. That is just an incredible amount of time. And I tell people all the time, one of the best advantages and the only real guarantee of home education, because I understand that home education isn't perfect, and we're all still learning. I was learning all the way up to the very last year I was doing it with my son. Uh, but the one single guarantee that you have is time. You have time to work on all of the things that you want to put into your child, whether it be academic, Christian discipleship, which, of course, for Christian home educating families, can and should be one of their primary drivers. So, sorry to interrupt there.
No, no, I appreciate you dialoguing with me on that. So another point I was going to make is, you talked about credentials and the level of education for a parent and how that relates to the outcomes for their children. And if I'm not mistaken, I hope I don't get this wrong, but it seems like Israel Wayne told me that his homeschooling mom, and she was one of the pioneers, only had a ninth grade education. And look how amazing him and his siblings came out. And so it's just a testament. My daughter-in-law that was one of her greatest concerns is that she wasn't qualified. She didn't think that she could homeschool. And of course, through the mentoring of our mutual friend Sam Sorbo, and actually working with our organization, she recognized that she is capable. And today, my grandchildren are 9 and 5, and she loves homeschooling. She posts on Facebook all the time about how wonderful it is, how rewarding it is, and she's so glad that she overcame these myths in the life of my grandchildren.
Yeah, there's
So,
another author named Nikki Truesdale who made that case in her book
yes,
called Anyone Can Homeschool. It's actually a book over my shoulder here, that I highly recommend, especially for those going through challenges, single parenthood, things of that nature, because she addresses those issues. I
right.
get questions that come to me from time to time, and I think people think, well, I'm going to get you with this question because I know you don't have the experience on this. So what do you do if you're a single parent? And I will answer, yes, I don't have the answer to that question from my experience, but I point to people who do, and who have that information. So I love to highlight those kinds of things.
Great. Yes. I'm a big fan of Nikki also. She's been on the podcast. I think she's going to be back on in a few weeks. And my daughter in law is a big fan of hers too. So she's going to be interviewing her. So actually, that was one of the things I was going to ask you would be your response because that's what I get all the time. I had it on a radio interview just the other day. Is they just make this assumption. Well, not every family can do that. Not every family can afford. They need the two incomes, and they can't afford private school. So what do you say about those parents? So what is your response when you get that question? Because I know you must get it too.
I do get it all the time, and I point to the willingness to sacrifice. So obviously, when it comes to the single parenthood, you're right. I didn't do it as a single parent. By way of an explanation, my wife actually was my children's primary home educator up through their elementary years, and when I retired from the military, I actually took it over. So I have a little bit of a unique homeschool dad position because from junior high all the way through high school, I was actually the main education facilitator while my wife pursued another opportunity in employment, which she did from home, by the way. So we're still all together at the same time. But my wife let me and was gracious enough to say, yes, I've done this for a few years. You can have fun with it. And I tell people all the time, I thought I understood my wife's sacrifice. I really did. I thought I completely understood her sacrifice until I did it. And then I realized I still underestimated that. But notwithstanding, those who've gone through other situations, like I said, Nikki Truesdale has a part of her book where she talks about homeschooling through those single parenthood years. And Israel Wayne is covered in some of his works about, the whole financial dynamic. Well, we've become a society that has literally become addicted to that two-income family. And it really is about maintaining what we expect for financial. And it is a huge sacrifice for families. I do not minimize that at all. But I kind of look back on my own upbringing, which was not in homeschooling, by the way. My parents did not have a lot of money, but they realized, like many parents did in the 70s and 80s, that government schooling was just antithetical to faith beliefs, and so they sacrificed to put us in small Christian schools. And so that was my upbringing. My upbringing was small Christian schools, and those schools did have some elements of what I'm talking about, taking away these educationally ineffective schooling paradigms. But not all of them. But I'm grateful for their sacrifice. And I saw the sacrifice that my parents made to put us in these small Christian schools, not because we were wealthy. My father was a mid-level NCO in the military, and trying to put 4 kids into a private school, even a small Christian private school, was a huge sacrifice for them. So what I tell people is this, especially if you come from a Christian worldview, start with the Bible. If you are convinced, and I believe if you look at the Bible, you will be convinced that it is a parental responsibility to teach, to train, to raise, to disciple. All of those synonymous concepts. Those are not like different things. They just bring them all together. All that big package is parenting, biblical parenting. And if you believe that God wants you to do that, then you seek out the opportunity that God, I believe, will give any parent who is searching for the answer to how to do that. God will provide that. Now, I know that there are cases where certain circumstances, a parent is not in the picture, a parent has passed away, there's divorce. I get all that. And this is where I tell people, well, if you get to that place where literally you physically think it's not possible, go to the community. The community that you have, faith community, home education community, those around you. Sometimes it's family, sometimes it's not family. I understand that as well. But find those resources to bring together. And this is where I believe churches can have a huge impact in this, is to be that provision for families who don't have one of the means or mechanisms in order to home educate their children. Some people will tell me I'm against Christian schools, and I will say this: I'm not against Christian schools. First of all, because I grew up in them and I understand their impact and their value, especially above government schooling. But there's also that outreach to those who literally don't have that capability, or who don't have parents who have that biblical mindset. And so, yes, there is an outreach opportunity there for church ministries to have an impact, just like families can have in their home education environment, or as close as possible to it is what I would suggest. So my answer is, go to God. Allow God to open up the windows of opportunity. And, in the very few, I think there are many fewer cases than we might imagine where things are literally just impossible to do, perhaps in a home education environment. That's where faith community and ministry come in to fill that need. It's a biblical concept, right? We are to provide for the widows and the fatherless. And in my estimation, those who either don't have a parent who can provide that education, or for some other reason can't or won't, that is where the ministry comes in to provide that need.
Amen. Very well said. We need to take a short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you to share your thoughts on the topic of government school choice initiatives. Don't go away. I'll be right back with my interview with Douglas Pietersma right after this. About 70% of government school teachers belong to national or state teachers unions, which have evolved into powerful political organizations. These unions frequently support leftist policies, including promoting LGBTQ agendas and opposing parental rights in education. Many of the policies and practices pushed by these unions are at odds with efforts to improve student achievement in fundamental areas like reading, writing, and math. The influence of teachers' unions has played a significant role in preventing meaningful reform and in maintaining the status quo in government schools. U.S. Parents Involved in Education believes that reducing union influence and restoring parental control are critical steps toward creating a better education system for all children. To join our movement, visit uspie.org and connect with us at USPie on Facebook and X. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today is Dr. Douglas Pietersma, a research associate at NERI, the National Home Education Research Institute. So many conservatives support school choice because they believe it helps family escape the government system. But you've warned, and so does our organization, that most school choice policies ultimately invite more government control. So talk to us about that.
So this is one of those kind of sticky issues. It's one where you mentioned it comes from conservatives very often. So as I'm active in legislative sessions in my state and working with other home education individuals and organizations in their state, it's one of those things where we find ourselves at odds with people who we are typically friends with and typically agree with on many other social issues or political issues and that nature. But it really does go back to the research, what we have seen, and just sort of the practical things that have been coming out. We've seen across the nation, almost every state has got something proposed, an education savings account, ESA, or a school voucher, or tax credits, or things of that nature. And the position of the National Home Education Research Institute is all of these things really become educational welfare. And when we look at the broader political spectrum and we look at things that the government tries to take care of, and basic welfare would be one of them, there are a lot of challenges in those systems. Our recent government shutdown has highlighted some of the things that have gone awry, some corruption and some wasteful spending and things of that nature in those kinds of programs. Well, we also know that that applies to education. We look at how much money we've been spending on education, generically, right, or the schooling, I should say. And we look at the results even by the school's own standards. The more money you put into schooling, that doesn't correspond to better outcomes, better grades, better progress, and so forth. And so as these things have been coming online, even more so since the COVID era, they've been even more prolific, I would say, since the COVID era. We've been trying to take a look at them, and so we don't have long range studies. It would be great for us to say, hey, we've got this 30-year study on this. Well, most of these programs are still in their infancy. In my state, we actually had one that passed 2 years ago. It was supposed to go into effect, then it got challenged by the law. It's currently on hold. So I don't have any stats about how that's going to actually work out, but we do have indicators. So when you look at states where this has been implemented for a bit longer of a time, Arizona would probably be one of the primary states to look at because they've had a program a little bit longer than others. And you look at what the goals are. Well, those that are proposing these systems, these not systems, I'm sorry, these programs would love to see sort of a breaking of the stranglehold or the monopoly that the unions and government and government agencies have on schooling. That's their intent. And so these programs come out with the intent that it's going to draw a bunch of people, out of the government schooling system, and that's going to force the government schooling system to change to meet the demand if they want to keep students and so forth. Those are all idealistic outcomes, but we haven't really seen them. As a matter of fact, when I talk to individuals in states who have had ESAs and voucher programs for a longer period of times, the majority of the people using those programs are already out of the system. They're people who were doing private schooling before, and now they have some money for private schooling. They were people that were perhaps homeschooling before, and now they have, money to spend on homeschooling supplies and things of that nature. And I understand that for some people, when they see that, they're like, well, it's there, and, I pay my taxes, so I want some of my money back. And there's a lot of different arguments that we could talk about. But the point of fact is it's not accomplishing the overall objective, of breaking the stranglehold of government on education or of the union control of that. So it's not having that effect. So when conservatives come to me and they say, we want you to get on board with this because this is the outcome we want. And I tell them this is probably not the outcome you're going to get based on what we've seen in other states. Um, and actually, more often than not, they don't want me to come on board with them. They just want me to not oppose it because because when I show up at legislative sessions, it's really interesting. The Education Association for our state will be like, okay, the homeschool guy's here, so we're going to have to, we're going to have to contend with him. But interestingly enough, on this particular issue, we end up testifying on the same side of the bill, meaning myself and for my state, the Education Association, which is a strange thing for us to be doing that. They, for completely different reasons than I do, but we end up testifying on the same side of a bill. So it kind of makes for some strange bedfellows. And the conservatives will oftentimes, there's a little bit of flashback on that and just, hey, why are you opposing this? And I tell them, I said, look at any government program. I worked in the government for 20 years. Anyone who has worked in, with, near, around, or has just observed the government for any length of time can tell you this. You put a government program out there, it may be simple to begin with. It may seem to be innocuous to begin with, but what do government programs typically do? They grow, they consume more resources. They tend to employ more people, not always to accomplish their original objective. And very oftentimes they get to the place where they are no longer even accomplishing what they were initially set out to accomplish. It becomes a bureaucratic monstrosity, sort of a self-licking ice cream cone that just won't go away, right? And so I tell individuals this is not a conservative position to take. School choice initiatives are not conservative because it is forcing one citizen to pay their taxes. They have to pay their taxes by force or they lose their property to cover the expenses of something that they very well might conscientiously object to. And I'll give an illustration. This is something very simple. I'm a Christian, make no apologies for the fact that I'm a Christian, and I would be totally against my tax money being taken by the government to fund a religious school. For instance, if it was a school of Muslim faith or if it was a school of some sort of an Eastern religion or something like that. I wouldn't want my government money going to that. I don't believe that type of instruction is something that I can, in good conscience, support. And people say, well, that's okay because the government schooling system isn't teaching any religion. I have a whole other segue we can get into on that. I do believe it teaches a religion. I believe it teaches a religion of secular humanism, as established by some of its founders, John Dewey being one of those. And I consciously object to that. I also wouldn't want my neighbor, who may not be of my religious persuasion or faith tradition, to pay for my children's religious instruction. And so as a conservative value, in order to support any type of school choice, you have to acquiesce to the idea of redistribution of wealth. And if I go to a conservative legislator or a conservative voter and I say, do you support redistribution of wealth? No, absolutely not. And I bring up certain things like, do you support universal minimum basic income? Absolutely not. I don't support that. Would you support universal health care? Absolutely, I would not support that. Do you support universal school choice? And there's usually a silence right there. And what gets them is, okay, you're talking about universal. When you throw that in there, here's what you've done. You've gone the socialist route. You've gone the government supply route that you avoid in just about every other area of your conservative political standings or conservative values that you have. And so if I bring that into the conversations, sometimes it has an impact. Sometimes it doesn't have the impact that I wish that it would have. But it's just not a conservative position to have. And so, yes, I still have to pay my property taxes. And yes, that still goes towards a schooling system that teaches religious instruction, in my opinion, that is antithetical to the Bible. And I wish it wasn't that way. I will keep fighting to see that it doesn't continue to be that way. But I also don't want to force somebody else to do that for me. So I wouldn't take money for that in my own children's home education. I know they're graduated now. The business I run would qualify as a ESA vendor in my state should my state's program finally get out of the court system and become effective. But I've already told people my business will not accept that kind of money because oppose it on a true conservative position of that is taking neighbors' money to fund something that they may or may not approve of. So that's my position, and I know Dr. Ray from NERI, the president of NERI, he wrote a paper called Educational Welfare, and you can even just search Educational Welfare with the acronym NHERI, and it'll pop up. It's an open access document that anybody can read for the organization's position on that issue.
Very well stated. I think you covered that thoroughly. Um, so I'll just move on to another topic. So you've said that institutionalized schooling, especially government-run schooling, is rooted in socialist philosophy. So can you unpack that, and how is it that the worldview shows up in modern public schools?
It kind of goes back to where I started way at the beginning of this podcast, and I'm gonna shout out to another book. I do this all the time, by the way. It's just I read a lot of books. I like to push it out there. Again, nobody's asking me to push their books, but Alex Newman wrote a book called "Indoctrinating Our Children to Death," and it just came
Mm.
out last year, 2024, I believe. And he's authored several other books. One with Sam Blumenfeld some years ago called "Crimes of the Educators," but indoctrinating our children to death does a deep dive into the historical precedents of what led us to what we have today. And we've already talked a little bit about it. We've mentioned Horseman, we've mentioned John Dewey. He goes back even further. He goes back to an organization or a group of people in the United States called the Owenites, and their idea of a socialistic society, which was a complete failure, was actually exported and became a model on which the Prussians built their educational system, and then that was re-imported back to the United States by individuals that wanted to model that Marxist type of a system. So when I talk about it being socialist, it's socialist in the sense that it was based on the idea of secular humanism. So you look at Horace Mann, you say, well, he was a Unitarian, so he was, and some people will say that falls within the Christian realm of faith. But when you look at what he wanted for faith instruction in what then was called the common schools, was a very watered down, offend nobody, take no strong theological stand on any kind of a position, and it basically watered down any kind of religious instruction that would have been provided. That was his ideal. Well, that sort of set the stage for what came afterwards. Of course, John Dewey coming years after, and there were others, but these are kind of the two bigger players, who was clearly a socialist. I mean, he proclaimed to be a socialist. He was a author and signatory to the Humanist Manifesto, the first Humanist Manifesto, and he made no bones about the fact that humanism was religious. It covered those religious aspects of life, the questions that we might ask. You know, how did we get here? What is our purpose? You know, is there a God kind of thing? Well, humanism answers those questions. They answer those questions with there is no God. We got here by naturalistic processes, hence the scientific presupposition of naturalism. That is the basis of all science taught in government schools these days. And that, you know, there is no right or wrong. That leads us into the relativism we see today. What is right? What is truth? And people today will ask the question, well, you know, my truth is not your truth. And that always makes ring in the back of my mind something from the Bible where Pilate says, what is truth? Right? Who can know truth? And of course, outside of a foundation, something such as the Bible, there is no standard of truth, and so that's what we have in our society. That has led basically to the implementation that we have seen in our schools of socialistic ideas, of the idea that all of us need to be trained in the same thing, that we all need to be evaluated by the same standard, that the outcome needs to be the same. Well, before we had that, we had a lot more innovation in our society. We had a lot more creativity in our society, and schooling has basically dumbed that down, if you will. There's books by John Taylor Gatto, by Charlotte Iserbyt, also one by Alex Newman and Sam Blumenfeld, that just really highlight that. And in the titles of several of those is, in fact, the phrase dumbing us down or being dumbed down. You look at the standards that we have had, and it really creates just a low level baseline for the citizenry so that the citizenry is now able to be controlled, able to be manipulated, able to be that makes them malleable to the needs of the state, not necessarily the needs of the individual. And so, that's kind of the idea of schooling being socialistic. But one of the things I like to point out is, we know that Marxism and socialism would love to put down anything religious or anything God related. And so we look back to perhaps the 1960s when the Supreme Court made decisions. No Bibles in schools, no Bible teaching in schools, no prayer in schools, at least nothing publicly or nothing, official and so forth. And a lot of Christians were shocked by that because at that point in time, almost all people who consider themselves Christians still put their children into the government schools. They thought there's still some good there. There's good people teaching there, which is true even to this day. There are, people who believe the word of God that are teaching there and trying to do what they can do. But a lot of Christians saw that and they said, well, wait a minute, now that's it. That's the beginning of the end, right? And so you have the modern Christian school movement, you have the modern homeschooling movement. Both of them really sprang out of that. But rather than look at those elements as sort of the beginning of the end, I tell people that those were the end of the end. That is where government schooling was headed from the beginning. Because even John Dewey noted publicly, and it's in his writings, that the plan to implement his design needed to be done slowly and subtly, without which there would be a tremendous uproar and opposition by parents, by families, by clergy against what they were trying to do. So they had to do it slow. So it kind of goes back to the old illustration. And just for the record, I've never tried this. Put a frog in boiling water and it'll jump out. If you put it in cold water and boil it slowly, it'll
Mhm.
it'll be tepid and accept its own death. Right? Again, I've never tried that in reality, but it illustrates literally how we got to where we are now. And we didn't get here in the last 10, 15, 20 years. We were here, meaning the end of that, in the 1960s. And so what has come after that is reactionary. Christian schools started up, many started up in the 70s and 80s, and they carried over what they knew, right? They took the schooling paradigm that they knew and they said, well, we're going to make it Christian. And unfortunately, in doing that, even though there was great intentions and many of those schools were very effective in raising up children who believed the Bible, like I said, I was a product of those kinds of schools. They still carried over many of the things that were schooling and that were not necessarily effective to education. Homeschoolers aren't immune to that. Many people who've brought their children out of government schooling have said, hey, what do I start with? Well, I start with what I know. I know schooling subjects, math, English, history, science. That's what we're going to start with. Perhaps they even use some of the same materials and they can carry over some of those same paradigms. So, what I encourage people to do is break free from those. And you will find yourself not only in a place of more liberty and more freedom, but definitely something that is counter to the socialistic model that we have in our government schooling system and conducive to actual educational freedom, which I believe leads to more religious freedom and more, passing on of conservative values by families to their children and so on and so forth. So I believe it has multiple effects, and I probably went overboard in that explanation and may have even gotten off on a rabbit trail or two. So
No, that was excellent. It reminds me of what I often say is that it's not just about protecting children, it's about protecting our country's freedom because that's what's at risk if we don't stop the indoctrination of children in government schools and raise up children who understand the value of our wonderful form of government, our freedom. And so I agree with you on that. So before we wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask you to share with us what your research shows about the outcomes for homeschool students with special needs. I'm sure that many parents feel intimidated by the idea of teaching their child that has learning challenges. So, what does your research show about that?
start off with talking about something a little more personal than research because there is a child in my home, one of the two children I have, that does have some very specific special needs due to both epilepsy as well as brain surgery that was for epilepsy control. And so I have a personal stake in this, if you will. And as a researcher, when I don't know something, I'm going to go out and learn it. So I have done a ton of reading on this. From the worldly standpoint, I wouldn't say I have any special education credentials, but I have read and studied this a lot and worked with a lot of homeschooling families. There is plenty of research out there. But from a personal experiential perspective, I can say this. Everyone I have talked to that has taken a child with any kind of a special needs and brought them into the home education environment has found it more conducive to their child's learning. I have yet to find anybody who says, I brought my child home and they did worse and now they're failing worse than they were in a government schooling system. So, just as sort of anecdotal evidence, if you will, I will put that out there. But there is a lot of information, and some of it's stuff I've already talked about. Student teacher ratios and academic engagement time. These are things that government schooling special ed programs will say this is necessary, right? These are the things that are needed for these children who have different capabilities, different aptitudes, different proclivities in their learning. And they try to do that still in a classroom environment. 15, 20 students to a special education teacher, even if there's a number of paraprofessionals working with them. No way that they can tailor education to each one of those child's needs. And so those same things that produce academic achievement in any other student, what you may say is neurotypical, are the things that are needed for those special needs children. And so if you look back at some of the research, there's some of it published through NERI. There was one published in 2002 by a professor whose last name is Duffy, just highlighting the advantages of bringing a child to that home education environment and being able to tailor education to exactly what they need, having that one-on-one instruction, having that dedicated time and focus that they need. And so there's a lot of tremendous advantages of that. One of the statistics I like to point to that I think is the most significant, and it's not a statistic specific to special needs, but Dr. Ray did a what they call a meta-analysis on studies that talk about student academic achievement. And 78% of those studies showed that homeschool students do better than their traditionally institutionally schooled peers. And when you throw a statistic out there like that, there may be the tendency to try to reverse it in your mind. So if 78% say that homeschoolers do better, maybe there's 22% that say homeschoolers do not as good, which is not actually accurate because the 22% that don't show a statistically significant advantage don't show a statistically significant advantage at all, which means, and I tell parents of students, especially special needs students, the worst you can do, the worst you can do is at least as good as an
Mm.
institutional schooling system. That's the worst. And there's a really good chance, a super majority of a chance, that you're going to be able to do better because you know your child better, you love them more, you know their proclivities more than a teacher could. And even a good special education teacher cannot know each child in that classroom as well as an individual parent knows that child. So there's the advantage. And there's still more research to be done. I'm not going to say that there's, statistical proof that every homeschool child that had special needs is going to do better than they could in a classroom. There are obviously some very extreme special needs situations that I cannot say that, this is the panacea for that particular situation. And I never really tried to get into the specific diagnosis. Well, my child has, this diagnosis or that diagnosis. I tell parents this all the time. You're the perfect teacher because you know them and love them the best. And homeschooling can be the perfect option because you have maximum flexibility. Whereas schools are still constrained. The amount of material, the type of teaching they can do, the student teacher ratios, they are still constrained. They're never going to be able to be maximally flexible to that child's needs to maximize their achievement, whatever that happens to be. And my special needs child actually just graduated this last summer, which was a tremendous thing. He's been post-operative for 14 years after his brain surgery, completed his high school requirements, got a regular high school diploma, and is now considering his work options. And so it's a great thing to be able to see that in real time, work with other families that have that same kind of a goal for their children. So I highly encourage parents who have those kinds of challenges and needs to consider taking the role of that over for their child.
Okay, that was wonderful advice. I appreciate you sharing that, especially your own personal experience. That really makes a difference. So, we need to take another short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you two questions I ask all my guests before closing the show. Don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Douglas Pietersma right after this. U.S. Parents Involved in Education believes government schools are irredeemable because of multiple deep-rooted problems. Government involvement has created an expensive, bureaucratic system that fails to educate children effectively. Colleges of education no longer focus on essential skills like reading, writing, or math. Teacher certification often requires adherence to ideologies that undermine real learning. State standards and assessments are frequently inappropriate and ineffective. Powerful teachers' unions advocate for adult interests rather than student achievement. Parents should remove their kids from government schools by any means possible. As families leave, lawmakers should adjust funding to reflect enrollment, introducing market forces to foster competition and innovation. This would improve education and reduce taxes for all citizens. To join our movement, visit uspie.org and connect with us at USPie on Facebook and X. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today has been Dr. Douglas Pietersma, a research associate at NERI, or the National Home Education Research Institute. Dr. Pietersma, we close our show with two important questions. What concerns you most about what's happening in education today, and what gives you hope?
Say the thing that concerns me the most is there are still a super majority of families who are still sort of stuck on the schooling paradigm because we've been ingrained over the last 150 years or so that this is how education happens. And again, at the beginning, I talked about separating education and schooling, but we've been so accustomed to saying, well, how do you learn something? Well, you take a class. Well, how do you prepare for a career? Well, you get a degree in certain things. And I'm not saying that that's always not the case. Obviously, there are careers that require it and need it. I wouldn't want to go to a doctor who had not done any medical school training and so forth. So, it's just a matter of being able to say, let's break away from that. And there are so many that are still ingrained in that. And I would say this is especially important from a Christian worldview in families who come from a Christian faith tradition. If you look at research by George Barna and the Barna Group and others that he has been associated with, there is a super majority of Christian families. And when I say super majority, you think about legislative, a super majority is 2/3, right? Um, Way above that, somewhere in the range of 75 to 90%, depending on the studies you look at, of Christian families who are still sending their children to a schooling system that is anti-God, anti-Bible, anti-conservative, values and morals and ethics. And so those children are coming home. And what are they bringing home with them? They're bringing home with them what they've been taught. A quote that I've used a lot of times from Voddie Baucham, we cannot continue to send our children to Caesar and then be surprised when they come home as Romans. There's variations of that quote. And I know Voddie Baucham passed away recently, but he was a tremendous impact on the thought process for a lot of home educators. That still concerns me, which is why I try to be an advocate. And I know I try to connect with other people who are advocates, not just for home education, but just for the realization that what goes on in government schooling is not conducive to conservatism, and it's not conducive to Christian faith. But I do have hope, as you asked. What is the hope? The hope is I believe parents are opening their eyes. Many, not all. You look at school board meetings, and some parents are going and they're standing up and they're saying, this book cannot be in my child's school library. Great, I applaud that. I really do. I also ask them, if I can, when I get an opportunity, let's question the system that allowed that to become standard in the first place, or that allowed that to become an option in the first place. And I think parents are opening their eyes. I think COVID, as crazy as it was, I think it caused a lot of parents to open their eyes. I don't describe public schooling at home as homeschooling. However, there were a lot of parents who, once their kids came home and they had to start doing that virtual online schooling, and they were looking over their shoulders and saying, this is what my kid's learning, and this is perhaps what my children are not learning. It shocked, it surprised. Hopefully, it opened up the aperture of their perspective to be able to say, there's got to be something different. And I know some people are, perhaps they're saying, okay, well, then I'm going to take them out and I'm going to put them in private school. And it's certainly a step better maybe than the government schools. Charter schools, I kind of put in the same bucket as government schools because they're still government funded and they fall under the same government laws. But hopefully opening the eyes of parents to be able to say there are better options out there, and there is more to education than completing a schooling program and getting a piece of paper and saying, I'm done with education. That applies to high school. It applies to college. That can be a whole nother discussion as well, as far as, students moving on into post-secondary education. But I do have hope. I do have hope because I'm seeing that. When I participate in home education conferences and conventions, here's an encouragement. I'm seeing fathers becoming more involved. Yes, a lot of the fathers are the full-time workers and they're not necessarily in the home all day doing the academic work, but they have a place, they have an opportunity to contribute to that. They have a role that I believe is very important for fathers. I talk about that a lot at conventions, and I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged by seeing families, and I'm encouraged by seeing Christian families, and even a few pastors who are coming on board and saying, okay, this isn't just about, what education the children from the families in my congregation get. This is really about ministry. This is about the gospel. This is about passing on the faith tradition. And yes, they can come sit in a Sunday school and a church service for a few hours a week, but that is going to do nothing if they spend 30, 35, 40 hours a week getting the antithesis of that at a government school. So I think pastors are coming along line, and I try to encourage them in their part that they can play in this as well. So yes, concerned, yes, encouraged, and as always, God is still in control.
Amen. So before we close, why don't you tell our audience how they can find out more about your organization, NERI?
Very good. You can find out about NHERI, NHERI.org, O-R-G. That is the organization that I work for. I do have some other affiliations as well, but for home education purposes, that's the one I like. That's the one I like to highlight. You can follow NHERI on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. You can also follow me personally. I will share personal things that I am able to put out, as well as NHERI information, and I am available on all of those platforms as well. And if you can spell my last name, I guarantee you can find me, because there's just not that many of me out there.
I believe that. And if you can pronounce it, you're doing even better.
Excellent. You've done well today.
Oh, thank you. I practice. So anyway, this has just been an eye-opening, wonderful interview. I appreciate it, and I know you have a depth of knowledge on other topics related to education and the focus of our show. So I'd like to invite you now to come on again in a few months, and let's have another discussion about some of the other issues and platforms you're involved with. So thank you once again, Dr. Pietersma, for being on the show with us today.
Ma'am, happy to be here, and I'll be glad to come back whenever you'd like to have me.
Excellent. And to our listeners, if you found today's discussion eye-opening, please share this episode with a friend, give us a 5-star rating, and subscribe to stay informed. You can connect with us on Facebook and X at USPI and visit uspie.org to join the movement. Until next time, I'm Sherry Few. Thank you for your support of USPI and our efforts to unmask government schools.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPI seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPI chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapters section.